Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper here. Today we've got Morsels for Mental Manducation. Yes, we are diving back into the final book of C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. Before we do that, in what I have been assured is a bent poker by a number of carvers, even though I couldn't identify it as that. Anyway, I've got another bowl of the Sutliff's Voodoo Queen that we'll talk about tomorrow. Today we kick off the first chapter in the final book within Mere Christianity. This final book is Beyond Personality, First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And the first chapter is entitled Making and Begetting. We're going to discuss the difficult concept of the Trinity throughout this book. It is a unique doctrine to Christianity, and I would argue is likely the single most misunderstood doctrine by Christians and non-Christians alike. The AC stopped. Nice and quiet. It's a difficult concept because God is outside of our space-time, and that therefore makes some things about God difficult to comprehend, to wrap our heads around. Well, why bother at all? Lewis gives a really good analogy based on his response to someone who had said, well, when I was out in the desert, I experienced God there. What do I need with theology? Lewis' response, I think, is spot on. He compared someone who is familiar with and has gone to the beach, familiar with the beach, knows that part of the ocean, may know that part rather well. But compare that person to the collective knowledge and experience of hundreds of people who have not only been to that beach, but have sailed the entire ocean and have created maps detailing everything about that ocean. In many ways, that is analogous to our experience personally of God and the collective wisdom of those who have gone before us, which is theology. Theology is very much like a map, so that we don't have to rediscover things about God. That doesn't mean that we have to take everyone's word for it. Just as we've all seen maps from 400 or 500 years ago that are obviously wrong or incomplete, if not wrong. Theology is not always a perfect description of who God is. How can it be? Theology is human. It's going to have gaps and holes. And yet you will get much farther by studying, becoming familiar with theology, than you would without it. Much as you get a whole lot farther across an ocean or around its perimeters if you have a map to tell you what's ahead. It's a pretty good analogy, I think. So the first aspect in this chapter that we're talking about, making versus begetting, or making and begetting, is this Father-Son notion within the Trinity. A number of places, Jesus is described as the begotten or the only begotten Son of God. This led to a very early misconception that Jesus then must have been a created being, created by God. But the word begotten, one that we don't use anymore, is something that describes what happens when a parent has a child. A father begets a son. A father creates a toy box. Begetting is like to like. Creating is non-like. So when we hear that Jesus was begotten, this is like to like. What does that mean? Well, for one thing, it means that whatever happened in this begetting happened outside of our space-time continuum. You see, we kind of get bogged down on this word begotten instead of taking a look at bigger, fuller context. For example, one of the places where this term appears is in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Now, that gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It goes on to describe that everything was created through him. Nothing that was created without him. Well, in that sense, he could not have been a created being if everything that was created through him. And here we are talking about our space-time continuum. In the beginning, that's the beginning relative to our time. And yes, time had a beginning. The Big Bang tells us that. We may disagree on how far back that beginning was, but there was a beginning. Jesus pre-existed that beginning. And what John is telling us is that in some way, Jesus was with God and he was God. He was this Word. Because later on we have the Word became flesh. John is describing Jesus. Dwelt among us. And there he is described, at least in the King James Version, as the only begotten of God. So we have to be able to put all three of these things together, all of this. He's begotten, he became flesh, and yet, at the beginning of our concept of time, he was God, and he was with God. There isn't a before that to us. And because we are limited by our space-time continuum, we can't fully comprehend what it means outside of that. What was before in the beginning? Well, what does before mean outside of our time? We don't know. If it seems that this is a difficult concept, well, yes, it can be, but everyday people are quite capable of digesting and comprehending difficult concepts. Does that mean that we will ever fully understand it? No. Do we really have the arrogance to demand that we fully understand everything that's outside of our space-time? I don't. Now, understand that's not a cop-out intended to brush aside or dismiss issues of questions about this or objections. That's the coward's way out. No. It is intended to temper expectations, though. Realistically, how do you expect to comprehend everything that is completely outside of your existence? We have trouble enough comprehending and discovering the things that are around us. So we'll take more looks at this concept of the Trinity in the coming weeks. But this is just the very first, that this father-son is not the same kind of father-son that we have in earthly human relationships, because our lives are temporal. God's is not. And so anything he begets is also not temporal. It is outside of our time. And the relationship between those beings is something that we cannot comprehend because it's outside of our space-time. This is just what we are told and described. And as we'll see, this does not actually in any way, shape, or form contradict what came before in the Old Testament. So I hope you will stick around and enjoy this discussion. It's interesting to me that Lewis chose to dive into this simply because Mere Christianity is intended to be about those things upon which all Christians agree. The doctrine of the Trinity is one that does not have universal agreement. If we stick to the Nicene Creed version, which talks about this begotten, not made, or not created, if we stick to that creed, then we have agreement among everyone who holds that. But it's not universal. So I was a little surprised the very first time I read this years and years ago that he decided to go there. Simply, like I said, because it's not an area of universal agreement. But we're going to dive in anyway and forge forward to finish this book. With that, folks, light something you like. Put those thinking caps on. Enjoy your afternoon.